Welcome, everyone, to this webinar on Günther Anders' The Atom Bomb and Human Obsolescence. My name is Jason Dawsey, and I'm Assistant Teaching Professor of History at Arizona State University, and delighted to be joined by my friend and fellow Günther Anders scholar, Christopher John Müller, who is the translator of Günther Anders, the first volume of Günther Anders' magnum opus, Die Antiquiertheit des Menschen in German, which Chris has rendered as the obsolescence of the human. And this webinar will be a discussion about this book, Chris's translation of the book, the place of Günther Anders really in our thinking about modern technology, critiques of technology, nuclear and thermonuclear weapons, mass media, this concept of Prometheanism, which is a central part of his work. All of this we're going to try to cover in this webinar. So we hope you find this of interest, whether you are someone who was quite familiar with Anders or you're someone who's now just coming to his work and interested in him, especially now with this translation, Chris's translation of the book appearing 70 years after it was first released with the West German publisher in Munich, C.H. Beck. So, all of that said, Chris, welcome. It's great to see you. Thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you so much, Jason, and it's such a pleasure. Thank you for making this possible. Now, I have been reading your work. I've been reading your work ever since I discovered or first came across Anders's work. Uh, that was about, I think, almost 15 years ago now. And at the time, I think your research, your PhD research, and your publications were some of the very few texts available in English. So I'm just tremendously grateful for all your scholarship over the years, for kind of helping establish Anders and making it possible for these translations to appear, all of which would have been even harder, I guess, had there not been like really strong work to be able to point to. So I'm just really delighted that we have this time to go over the book, I guess.
Chris, thanks very much. And obviously, you and I have been discussing Anders now for well over a decade. We're going to say more about what we've contributed to the scholarship on Anders, and obviously about this particular really crucial translation. But for our audience, I want you to be aware a bit about Chris's background, aside from this translation of the obsolescence of the human. He is senior lecturer in media studies at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. His research addresses the intersection of technology and emotion, and he also translates a media theory. He is the author, and I want to show it here. He is the author of this important book. We'll say more about this and its topic a little later. Prometheanism, Technology, Digital Culture, and Human Obsolescence, which appeared in 2016 with Roman and Littlefield. And we also want to mention here that he co-edited the Palgrave Handbook of Critical Posthumanism. So, Chris, likewise, when I was thinking about putting together something on Anders, a webinar on Anders that's tied in with the larger series on World War II that we've done here at ASU, you were the first person that I thought about that has done not only incredible translation work, but this Prometheanism book, along with several other articles out there. And of course, you and I collaborated on a translation of a piece in English rendered as Resistance Today that Anders published in the early 1960s. So it's so great that this has really come about after all of these years of talking about Anders. And I just want to note a couple of things, Chris, since the book has been out now for several months, and obviously you'll be able to say more about how this translation's come about and already a little bit about the initial reception. But the book itself, there's a blurb here on the back that notes, in fact, that Anders is viewed as, quote, eerily predictive of current debates. And you yourself say of Anders that, quote, his voice speaks with an immediacy that requires no supplementary commentary. So, one of the things I think we'll be able to get into today is that this issue of the currency of Anders, and yet also at the same time, he comes out of a very different context from our own. So I think we'll be able to see kind of both aspects of this. And I hope it really does enrich people's um, appreciation and an approach to this text when they do encounter it, when they do come across it someplace. So with that said, Chris, why don't we talk a bit about who he was? Some of our audience will know more or less about him than others, but what do you think we should know about Anders in terms of his biography?
Yeah, no. Um, it's always a good place to start with the biography and Anders, not because we need to know about his life so much to understand his thoughts, but because Anders dramatizes his own life and his life experience as part of the obsolescence of the human, and it's very kind of strange and unique way of narrating its subject matter, the growing power or of technology, the growing way in which um, machines, devices, technological realities are shaping our everyday lives, realities of war, realities of work, of interaction, and and this kind of looming fear or threat that technology is somehow reconfiguring human existence in ways that are unrecognizable, deeply alienating, or more alienating than Marx's alienation ever could have foreseen, and this quest for looking for a language. So I think it really helps getting a sense of how Anders is exploring these ideas. Now, in preparation for today, I think Jason and I went back and forth and we tried to kind of structure it a bit. We prepared a slide deck that I'm going to try to share. We'll not have it up a lot, but we'll share a few moments. Um, so I think, well, here we have a slide with the book itself. I think we might come back to this. Let's start with Anders' life. And Jason, you come in at any point. I think these are just some key points here. Günther Anders is actually born Günther Stern. Um, and he's the son of a very eminent academic family, Clara and William Stern. He conducts a PhD under Edmund Husserl, so phenomenology. He's kind of, I guess, on track for this quite bespoke academic career in philosophy, very much at the cutting edge of his time. And then the rise of, I guess, Hitler and Nazism really transformed his academic prospects, and in reality, at the university, he flees into exile to Paris, where he initially, I think, maintains academic ambitions, or that's what we, I guess, have to assume. He publishes quite erudite academic essays on the worldlessness of the human, and here we can speak about this term as a very ontological condition, right? We're born needing to find a place in the world. These kind of very general ideas that he later describes as apolitical are shaping his thinking. And then, really, I think what is most relevant for our discussion of the book is that from 1936 to 1950, roughly around then, he emigrates to the US where he is working a whole range of jobs, right? He describes them as odd jobs in his texts, ranging from working in tuna can factories in LA to film prop assistant to, I think he briefly works for the war propaganda office, um, all sorts of tutoring jobs. At this time, he's declared an enemy alien upon account of his German citizenship, which quite ironically was actually revoked by the Nazis. So, in a sense, he's a stateless, caught between these big bureaucracies. And I think in this time, the idea of worldlessness, of not having a world, not being permitted to the world, is kind of completely revised and rewritten through this experience of being an outsider. And Then upon his return to Europe, and he doesn't return to Germany, but to Vienna with his where his second wife Elisabeth Freundlich is from. So, and in that time, he really starts publishing very, very prolifically, and not as part of a university career, but kind of as a what I guess we would today call a public intellectual. And the obsolescence of the human, the Antiquiertheit des Menschen is clearly like the most significant publication of this early phase and kind of establishes Anders as as a kind of a public figure who's constantly in the newspaper writing for a public and in this kind of almost oppositional stance to a lot of ways university research and philosophy is dealing with topics such as, nuclear weapons technology and recent history. So, don't know, Jason. I'm sure you you will have spotted gaps I wanna add maybe.
This is really great, Chris, and I think it gets us off to a good start. I think for our audience, just a few things that I would just add is that um, Anders was in the Anglophone world for so long was largely known, if at all, through his connections to other major intellectual luminaries. Chris mentioned, just showed, Husserl being in there. His father was this very prestigious psychologist, William Stern, who was unfortunately then and now still best remembered because of the intelligence quotient, the IQ, even though he did a vast amount of work, wrote a general psychology, wrote about child psychology. Günther and his two sisters, Hilda and Ava, were subjects that they analyzed for some of their work. But he was a very important figure, maybe not quite at the level of Sigmund Freud, but he wasn't far removed in the early 20th century in terms of the world of academic psychology. And after studying with Husserl, he spends time studying with Heidegger. He goes to Marburg after Heidegger leaves Freiburg and him there and is we'll actually talk later. I'm sure Chris, both of us have gone over these passages before where he referred to being under Heidegger's demonic spell for a bit, in the 1920s. Um, Contacts with Max Scheler, but there's also this side of him in the late years of the Weimar Republic. He became close to Bertolt Brecht, the great Marxist playwright and poet, was heavily influenced by Brecht, especially in terms of like how to think about writing for starting out really for a working class audience, and then his own views about popular writing will evolve. And he was affiliated with the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, and and especially with Herbert Marcuse, the two of them had a long friendship. Obviously, they shared a great deal of interests, and it's also worth mentioning, Chris, right, that his cousin was Walter Benjamin. So, I mean, anyway, that there's a reason why people often just know him for who he was connected to. His first marriage was to Hannah Arendt. They were married for 8 years, and so I think one of the things those of us in the English speaking world have been trying to do is uh, to make sure he was not only known for these ties, but he was a significant figure in his own right, and that's long since been recognized in Europe, in German and Austrian scholarship, and now a large French and Italian language scholarship. And it's great to see that the English language work on him has really been catching up too, Chris. And obviously, with your translation, it's really going to be significantly pushed forward. I thought, with this kind of background out of the way, because some of these things we can come back to later, that maybe for our audience we just kind of open this book up a bit. It's called The Obsolescence of the Human. The subtitle, On the Soul in the Age of the Second Industrial Revolution. And maybe the way of dealing with a book that's this dense and complex, and awaiting a complete translation for so long is what is the main argument, the main idea of the book here, Chris? And this gets us into this very complicated notion of the Promethean gradient.
Yeah. No, that's I think that's a good place to start, and it's a cue for me to return to my slides. And just quickly, maybe, so people who are not familiar with this book, this might help in terms of just having a sense of the structure of the book. So the book is built around four main chapters that are almost separate books in themselves. They kind of stand as, some of them are really almost book length. The book as a whole, I would describe as kind of mapping the feelings, the emotional landscape of how life feels when it's shaped by very powerful and complex technological objects. And it's theorizing what itself calls the ongoing destruction of the future. So the sense that the decisions we make about technology today will go on to shape the future and maybe in a very real sense, make life uninhabitable, the world uninhabitable. That's, the nuclear dimension of this text. But also perhaps in a more figurative sense, that technologies are being developed that make life unlivable for a vast amount of people who are caught in a certain underclass, a technological underclass, who are like factory workers and or condemned to watching TV. Those kind of framings become really powerful. And so the main thesis of the book, this idea of the Promethean gradient, is that somehow technological objects have become so powerful that we as individuals really struggle to understand how they shape our lives, how we should best use them, what the hidden kind of tendencies of objects are, and that in some way we're all struggling to catch up, right? Both as individuals, as societies, as legislators, that somehow technology is racing ahead and maybe establishing what he calls a pathological world condition, right? So it's kind of opens on that grand thesis, which we'll, I'm sure, return to again and again. Now, the four main chapters are actually very kind of, in a sense, interrelated very deeply, but they also have a very different kind of feel and tone to them. On Promethean shame, which is an essay I really, really, really love, is written as a set of anecdotes and diary entries, and it introduces this notion that we're feeling inadequate in front of powerful machines, that we experience ourselves as a malfunctioning machine, right? We're already actively desiring to be like machines, to have the kind of uh, level of perfections machines can attain. And he's really talking about this really personal encounter between individual users and machines. The world is Phantom and Matrix. Really is what it says in the title. It's a reflection on broadcast technologies, radio and media, radio and television, that establish this kind of live link between something happening elsewhere right now, right? And it's important to say maybe at the time, practically all television was live television. So it's trying to think about a reality in which suddenly effigies of other people can appear in our house, but we don't experience them as representations. So the first chapter is called The Home Delivered World, and it's a really powerful, or the first section, and it's a really powerful mediation on the power of TV and radio. Being Without Time, Beckett's Godot, is a very short text, and Anders actually almost forgets in the introduction that it's even in the book. He doesn't mention it while he's introducing the whole work. It's a response to Waiting for Godot, Beckett's text that had been, the play had been staged just a few months before Anders wrote this piece. It's thinking of, it's equating the play to the fate of, I guess, the underclass, the world of the unemployed, the people who have been robbed of meaning because technology has taken over all meaningful things and rendered their life under a dictate of a rhythm imposed by this kind of mechanical world. And then the final chapter on the bomb and the roots of our apocalypse blindness is really trying to map out what a planetary reality or life on planet Earth and in the future looks like in the shadow of nuclear weapons that at the time of writing were actually already hydrogen bombs, right? So he Anders is in this chapter constantly blurring the distinction between atom bombs and hydrogen bombs and kind of amplifying and exaggerating this whole reality. So it's kind of a multifaceted book with so many different angles and aspects, but it's held together by, I think, this quest of looking for a language of how to talk about this emotional reality. So I might just hand over back to you, Jason, because I mean, I should add maybe, and that might be a good point for you to come in. When we first met, you were always foregrounding the centrality of Marx and the centrality of certain Marxist framings to the book, which I was possibly less alert to than you. So there's also that whole dimension of Anders's work, which runs through all of these chapters very strongly.
Oh, thank you for that terrific overview. I think for our audience, it's just great to see what is in this book and how I mean it looks very it's there's something kind of perplexing, I think, when you just glance at the table of contents. I remember when I first saw the book, you know, I'd heard about it. I was actually introduced to Under's work by a professor, Michael Geyer, who taught German history at the University of Chicago, and I had never heard of him before. And Geyer was very interested, still is very interested in the work of Hannah Arendt, and so knew of Anders. We just noted these connections, but he was fairly familiar with the arguments themselves, and then later discovered that my advisor, Moshe Postone, was also familiar with Anders. In fact, I can say more about that later. There was quite a surprise I discovered after his passing about how much he knew of Anders, and in fact some contact between them. But one of the things that struck me, Chris, when I first opened the book is like, what holds this together? You know, there's an essay on the atom bomb, there's an essay on radio and television, there's something on Samuel Beckett, there's this notion of Promethean shame. Um, but obviously, you've already pointed out there is something that holds this together here. There's really a kind of you could talk about on the one hand a radical and very pessimistic kind of critique of modern technology, but there were a lot of people, including in this period, who wrote major critiques of technology. Under's teacher Heidegger, of course, became um, known worldwide, and unfortunately, in my opinion, Anders became kind of mapped on to Heidegger's perspective because Heidegger's perspective was one that everyone wanted um, to examine. But there are also figures like Jacques Ellul in France at the same time. There'll also be, he's been working already for a number of years. Lewis Mumford in the United States works like Technics and Civilization, and he writes in the 60s a big 2-volume book called The Myth of the Machine. Um, Arnold Galen, who was also a conservative, West German conservative, wrote about technology. Anyway, you could go on and on and on. Under's friend Hans Jonas will later write about technology and ethics. Herbert Marcuse, I think, probably very familiar to some of our viewers. Works like One Dimensional Man. You're getting a kind of Marxist, perspective here. But I would just say one other thing. We're certainly going to say more about um, Marxism in this text. But one of the things that's really striking about it, Chris, is the attention to, I guess, what you could call heteronymous forms of subjectivity that have that have emerged with what he's calling here the second industrial revolution. This is a term we're going to need to unpack, as well as like what does he mean by the soul exactly here. But something like Promethean shame, you get this notion of the mass hermit in the piece on radio and television. Um, this it's interesting. The Beckett essay, the waiting for Godot, the waiting is really crucial, right, for Anders. This kind of passivity, which is a big running theme of the text, and then the last essay on blindness to apocalypse. So that in itself is really startling, I think, for a reader. Like these categories, um, what do we do with these, and how do these hold together? And that's one of the things that's very exciting and demanding about the book is figuring out what kind of perspective on technology you really are dealing with here. And that takes me to this next issue, Chris, is something you have said in a couple of conversations, which I think is really insightful about the book. I think helps us make better sense of this book, especially now with it in English in its entirety, which is you have described the obsolescence of the human as a very American text. So could you explain what you mean here by when you say that this book, there's something quite American about it?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an eerie thing translating because we spend a lot of time with text and that's one of the and maybe too much time to think about how how meaning takes shape and where it comes from. And it's clear that not only is the book to a large extent talking about experiences that Anders made in America, so California, New York, there's all these little vignettes that places in encounters with American technology. It's also a completely different kind of reality, right? America, even in the 1930s, is technologically much more advanced than old Europe, right? The old world of Europe. And the way I think technology is framed and technology is staged and talked about in I guess just public media is very different. And it's clear from the texts that we have from Anders that there's a significant culture shock, that he feels pretty alienated, that he feels pretty in a sense, awkward in his old European, highly intellectual, educated self. And yet at the same time, I think what really sets Anders apart, rather than maintaining this elitist attitude, looking down at this popular world or looking down at popular culture, he discovers in it a world historical force that is related to a real structural change. And I think that's the kind of second industrial revolution could almost maybe this in some extent with a lot of provisos might be called the American Revolution in the way that it's framed by the book. I just want to come back to maybe why I mentioned your work on Marx, because I think it actually helps us understand the book. So a few years ago, you wrote a wonderful essay unpacking Anders's relationship to Marx, and it really made things connect for me. And I think I'm just glossing from memory. You say something like Anders takes Marx a step further, where Marx says, workers need to become conscious of the labor conditions that are exploiting them, and that is kind of the political project. Anders adds to this that there's now a technological factor that is so strong and that is shaping us so strongly that we are no longer able to become conscious to the technologies that are kind of subjectifying or structuring our lives, right? And that this complicates the kind of relationship. And this is actually how the book is introduced, right? It's kind of trying to say how should we portray lives that are shaped by technology, are in a sense almost an imprint of the technologies that exist. And he says he can only attempt to do so through these kind of partial pictures, these exaggerated caricatures, capturing the multiplicity of different positions, but all of them lead back to this technological world condition that he relates to the second industrial revolution, that date of the second. Now, I don't know, Jason, how you read the second. I don't want to make presumptions. But one of the ways Anders frames this in the Promethean Shame essay is by comparing a violin to like an instrument to a machine, where he says, like, if we learn to play an instrument for a very long time, um, it will be a very cumbersome new thing. But as we develop our expertise, it will become part of our sense of self, expand our capacity to express ourselves, allow us to really inhabit new experiences and create music. Whereas something like a conveyor belt, and this is what he's talking about, will do something quite opposite. It will force us to acquire the habit of not following our own impulses or our own path. We need to concentrate to maintain the kind of persona the machine requires to work smoothly. And I think that might be one of the turning points, but there would be many different ways in which this could be framed.
Yeah, I think that really gets us into some, I think some really fascinating aspects of this work and of the theory of mechanization that's here. And you've already touched on a few of them, Chris. I don't want to just go over the ground that you did. I think that already kind of laid out what I think people who are interested in Anders, what they're going to get here is there is a kind of historical framing that's happening, even though what's telling is that the notion of industrial revolution, he really develops it much more in a second volume that comes out in 1980. And aside from some things that Chris has done and the like, just for our audience's sake, that book is largely still untranslated. And it's even longer. It's over 400 pages in German. It's significantly longer than the first volume, but there's an essay in there where he talks about three industrial revolutions, and the first is a kind of the classic industrial revolution that we know started largely in the United Kingdom, um, textile production, but also things like the steam engine that developed there, the locomotive. Anyway, this is all quite familiar and begins in the mid late 18th century and then spreads. But he has this notion of a second industrial revolution in this text, which one would just gather that category is grasping things like these broadcast technologies you've already noted. Um, there's these really interesting comments in here about assembly lines that he has here. Um, and of course things like thermonuclear weapons. And we can't, of course, leave out, Chris, the comments scattered as they are here about the use of industrial technology in the Holocaust to perpetrate a continent-wide genocide. So the gas chambers and crematoria of the Nazi involved in the Nazi genocide of European Jews, these are central for him too, because people might just ask, well, what does he mean by technology? And these are some other instances of what he's getting at. He talks about early computers a bit in the book, Chris, which you draw attention to um, in a piece that follows the text itself. Some really, um, I mean, really very rich, commentaries there. But since you brought up the comment about Marx, and we're talking here about the historical framing, I thought I would just very quickly read something from the introduction where he lays this out, including where Marx kind of fits in his thinking. And so he says here that this book doesn't ask what Washington or Moscow make of technology. So um, a clear assertion that this book is not taking one side of the Cold War divide. Um, at all. It's not focused on either the U.S. led bloc or the Soviet led bloc. The issue for him is what technology has made, is making, and will make of us before we have the chance to make anything of it. Napoleon declared politics our fate 150 years ago. Just a reminder, this is 1956 when the book comes out. Marx, this is interesting here too. And 100 years ago, Marx declared the economy our fate. It is in this sense that technology has become our fate today. Although we might not be able to be the hand that guides it, this doesn't mean we should deny ourselves the opportunity to keep a close eye on what its fingers are doing. So it's really something here, Chris. We're kind of seeing an argument about, you know, really like these stages almost of history going back to the French Revolution and Napoleon. Politics is our fate. Then you could say the economy is our fate, and Marx seems to be set up here as the representative theorist of that. And then Andres is saying we're in a new epoch. Technology is our fate. Um, and I don't know how much you want to make of this here, Chris, but it's interesting when you get to volume two, 24 years later, then he doesn't use this language of fate. He'll then say, which is much closer to a vocabulary linked to Hegel and Marx or Hegelian Marxism, that technology has become the subject of history. Um, it strikes me, and you may have a different view on this, is that the formulation about fate, technologies are fate, it's the German word is Schicksal, that this allowed some people to see him as closer to Heidegger, who sometimes would play with this language of fate and destiny, destinings of being, that I think made him seem closer to that than he actually was. But he will revise this language. And then in volume two, in fact, you get a place there where he'll even give you like a sketch, like 1815, politics is our fate. 1845, the economy is our fate. 1945, technology is our fate. So he comes back to these ideas. He elaborates on them. And there's something I think one can say about the book, Chris, that it's kind of unfinished. Like it's a theory that's still even in development into his later years. He dies in 1992, as your slide indicated, and there was a third volume that never did appear. So he's coming back to these things. He rethinks earlier positions that he made, and that is one of the reasons I think people find him so challenging, and
Mm.
rich as a thinker. So unless there were some other things you wanted to say, was
Oh,
about this question about the Americanness of the text, I thought we would talk about the translation, but are there things you wanted to bring up
maybe,
still
yeah.
left
I
on the
just wanted to come in
please?
quickly because I think your comment is so perceptive about Schicksal. And I hadn't actually thought about it. And I just think it's a really important observation. Um, it clearly isn't used in the way that Heidegger uses in the text. In German, we also say Schicksal is the thing that happens to you. You know, it's like a misfortune, our misfortune almost, right? And and I think it's a really important sense that the book at no point argues that we should somehow return to a previous state of technology. It's not nostalgic for some kind of golden age of the past. It's very actively condemning the kind of politics that is trying to lead us in that kind of direction. And it's also not saying we can stop technological process progress, right? It's kind of saying now that it is our misfortune to be in this technological world, right? We need to find a way of living in this changed reality in which we as individuals are constantly catching up. And I just felt maybe to give a sense how radical this idea is, it might be that in a sense leads into the question of translation. Um, it might be worth just I try to find some sort of representative image of the kind of technological condition he's talking about, because it's a distinctly mundane one. So the Promethean Shame essay, which for me actually really makes it an American book, starts with this anecdote that he's, joined a tour to an exhibition of technology tour with a friend, and he's observing how his friend is completely kind of bewildered by the modern technology on show. And just as context, I did a bit of research trying to figure out which one, what does he talk about? What kind of technology? And then apparently in LA around that time, there was kind of almost weekly features of exhibitions of new technologies, and they would be called like the future world or the home show or the electronic future or something like that. And you would get a lot of firsts. Here, for instance, is a first demonstration of a built-in electric oven. And the way that Anders is talking about the world of technology in this text, it's very easy for us today to make these very quick leaps to, oh, he's predicting AI, or he's predicting these really like kind of technologies that often quite literally do what he is projecting. But at the time, he is deducing this from a technological environment that is, you know, our everyday lived reality, right? That we don't think seconds about. And I think that is really kind of one of the achievements of Anders' work, and I think what makes it so powerfully relevant to the present is that it's able to show us something or build up, dramatize an experience of interacting and living with technology and what it can do on our behalf or what it allows us to do, that that translates the kind of familiar into something unfamiliar, strange. We want to, but not one we shy away from, right? And as a translation, as a task of translation, that was really the hardest and most time-consuming task. Is how to capture this voice, this strategy of in a sense being pessimistic, of dramatizing, of exaggerating, of using all sorts of stylistic means to build up the very subject matter that he's talking about, right? If we're gonna trust Anders's assessment that there is something deeply unsettling about the way technology shapes our lives, that at once needs to be credible and recognizable, but it's not allowed to actually bring out those feelings because we will probably stop reading. At the moment, it becomes a bit too real or it becomes a bit too personal, is one we kind of look away. And I think Anders, one of the advices he seems to adopt is to become a persona in his own text. He talks about his own feelings. We meet many different voices of Anders. He speaks as a kind of a doomsayer moralist. He speaks as a kind of very kind of likable person. He can speak in ways that are really quite, where he's not that sympathetic, where we're not in his corner, where he seems to be punching down. Sometimes he's punching up. So there's a lot of different variants of Anders in this text, and that was one of the main challenges, is to try and capture that multiplicity whilst also maintaining a steady identity, right? Can can this persona Anders develop throughout the whole text? It's a long book. So translating one page of Anders is not too challenging, but then the longer it gets, the harder it becomes to kind of find new versions of the register, I guess.
Well, the result I think really speaks for itself because it's such an impressive translation. There are reasons why the book in its entirety took 70 years to appear in English. One could even begin to talk about what happened with earlier efforts that kind of ran aground. We won't get into all of those here. That could be something for another webinar or a publication of its own. But you just pointed to the fact that there is something very difficult about translating Anders, even though he would take great pride in his accessibility. that he was not as jargon laden um, a thinker as other figures. And he would point to someone like Adorno, for example, that the difficulty of reading Adorno's prose, that his prose was far less burdensome to the reader. Whatever you think of that claim, um, that was in many ways, I think, under self-understanding, and that he really would say things like, I could care less what academic philosophers think of my work. Um, that I'm not really interested in what they have to say about it or not. I'm writing for a much larger audience. But Chris, that there's these things about persona voicing in the text. He uses a variety. If you look beyond the obsolescence of the human, um, such a variety of different genres he works in. This book obviously has these things like these diary entries that get brought in, right? And comments on newspaper clippings, like some piece in a newspaper that he makes it a significant issue for a particular essay. We also get things like the open letter. He writes plays, he writes poems, he writes novels, and he writes short fiction. We get with Beckett like at least some sense of Anders as the critic of modernist literature. He wrote about Bertolt Brecht, his friend. He also wrote about Alfred Döblin, the author of Berlin Alexanderplatz. Anyway, there was a side of him that did that. He wrote about John Hartfield, who did all this work as a leftist in visual arts, this photo montage work. We could go on and on and on. That he has these interests as well. So he's very difficult to just pin him down to one particular um, style or voicing or form of narration. He does a lot. He'll often reproduce like a dialogue with someone. Like even in this text, when you're getting in the piece on the bomb, he's talking about being on a train. And there's issues about the bomb and human existence. And you wonder, did this really happen? Did this conversation really happen? And maybe it doesn't matter that much whether it happened or not. Um, it may be much more important to figure out what is he trying to get across to
Mm.
um, the reader, right? So this is part of I think for anybody coming to his work for the first time, or maybe you're kind of deepening your familiarity with him. It's good to be aware of this with Anders. He's a very complicated figure as a writer. Um, I think at one point in a later interview, he described himself as a kind of philosophical writer.
Yeah.
That he wasn't really a philosopher per se. He was more like a philosophical writer, and he was a writer who might write texts like Obsolescence. He also might be someone who wrote fables. He wrote obviously a collection of fables, right? Der Blick vom Turm, the view from the tower that appeared in 1968. So this is really showing, I think, a bit, Chris, about the different like stylistic strategies in obsolescence and
And
how demanding it is to translate him. And so I think it makes it all the more really all the more wonderful, like the job you've done on this in holding this book together. Because when you read it, you realize, yes, this is Anders throughout. I can identify him even if there's shadings that are different. He comes across because you and I've talked about it. The piece on radio and television reads so differently than other texts here. Um, Yet I think it's such a marvelous translation.
I've,
And I think people will really benefit so much from the fact you have taken all this time to make sure that there was a consistency there that held it together. So
and
speaking of holding it together, Chris, why don't we just say a bit? We talked a bit about industrial revolution um, and what we're getting here from Anders and what we'll get from him later on. We appreciate the reader's patience with the fact that they just can't go unless they read German and pick up volume two. But we do want to at least allude to some of these other writings of his. But the notion of the soul, Chris, die Seele in German, what do you think we do with this in terms of understanding what Anders is trying to grasp with this category?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting and difficult and productive uh, term, die Seele. And I know there's a lot of people interested in this, and I had the pleasure recently to have a longer conversation with a with a very impressive group of people um, who were climate activists, right? And they're grappling with this idea of the soul, of what it means to live in the times we are in a changing world, in a changing planet, what it does to us. Now, Anders speaks about the soul in many different ways. I think it relates to what we might call, or what Anders calls, the capacity to feel, the fact of feeling, the fact that we feel. Um, and there's this central motif that is running throughout the book, that somehow the power of technology is becoming too much to comprehend. And I think one of the editorial decisions we made, and I should really mention Christian Dries, who co-edited the book, and we had a lot of conversations about how much do we want to put in a commentary, how much do we want to kind of annotate additional points. And at times we felt strategic inclusions where we can help signal where terms have a really long history of in Anders's own work, would be helpful. And one of those was um, related to the term, the begriff die Seele. And as you mentioned, style and writing, I thought it might be a nice thing to quickly look at one of Anders's poems that he was actually published in 1940. I'll just bring it up because I think it will really help us understand or see how this is framed. So this is a newspaper called Der Aufbau. It's the newspaper of the German Jewish Club of New York. A lot of emigres are writing. It's a German language newspaper, and I should add that Anders really, really struggled with English. He couldn't feel at home in this language. There's a lot of writing in which he's complaining that he can't really bring himself to word in this language. He feels patronized by the way he's spoken to. And here there's this little poem from August 1940, printed right into the newspaper. And it's called Der Mensch ist kleiner als er selbst. So humans, you are smaller than you are. And this sentence appears again and again in the Obsolescence later on. So this is I guess, a headline that has stuck with Anders over at least 15 years, right? And he introduces this motif that you can kill thousands of people with the technologies of destruction, but that when it comes to the work of the soul, um, it can't somehow reach the power. It can't expand itself to the power of what we can actually do. So he's saying, poor, abjectly meager, we wished and made the soul, a fool who called it godly, infinite. See, the power given you to act is greater, more tremendous than the space freed in your heart to comprehend. So this imbalance, this kind of sense that somehow um, powers that are human made, that are actualizing themselves through human endeavors, are nevertheless a human, inhuman, soul destroying, or excessive to the soul. And that a lot of these, or this is certainly one aspect of Anders's work that is making an appeal to the soul, addressing us on that level, and perhaps this brings us back to your perceptive comment about fate. It is now our tragic fate to live in this world where we are smaller than we are. We're never again going to be the right size. Maybe we never were, but how do we cope and deal with this? How do we inhabit this present? And how do we make sure that the tendencies and dynamics that are leading to this kind of shrinking of the soul uh, do not even gain more traction? And I think Anders, there's a certain tragic arc to a lot of his work where he's basically, um, trying to find this kind of language of solidarity between the people who are now inhabiting this soulless world that is in a very real sense soulless. So that's one of the, I guess, very kind of traceable uses of the word soul. I'm sure it comes with a lot of additional registers that and comments, but that's one that so that poem is in a sense already a dramatization of this idea of the Promethean gradient, right? That we can do more than we can comprehend or be responsible for.
That's it's such an interesting discussion, Chris. So I appreciate you kind of taking our audience into that because it's interesting that in volume two, he talks about the destruction of life in the third industrial revolution. So the notion of Zela, not to say that it totally drops out, um, is harder to find. It's more elusive in the third volume. And you noted, I think quite rightly, that there's a kind of search for adequate categories that we're seeing here. And it's really it's quite visible in the text. Like he's clearly searching for adequate concepts and adequate language, a lexicon to talk about these things. The book opens for people who have not read it yet. The book opens with these, like he's defending a perspective being articulated here against somebody accusing him of being like a reactionary, a backward-looking reactionary about technology, just saying, you can just choose not to use this device or not. So he notes elsewhere about views about technology as neutral, that it's the person or the organization or the political party or the regime or whatever it might be, that they use technology for positive or negative um, purposes, but technology itself is neutral. So obviously that's something he challenges here. But before we move on to this, Chris, I thought kind of coming back to your translation, I wanted to make our readers kind of aware of, I think maybe some things that tie together your discussion of Die Seele, the soul, with the notion of the Promethean gradient. You also might call it, Chris, as you do, the Promethean gap. That people, he even will indicate that rendering of it in English will work. He does that many years um, later. And speaking of gap, you use it right here. So he says here, this is from the introduction. This just like the quote I read about Napoleon and Marx and technology as our fate. He says, besides the difference between the conditions of production and ideological theories, there is also the gap between making and imagining, the gap between doing and feeling, the gap between knowledge and conscience. And finally, and most importantly, and I think Chris is interesting, right? That he saves this one for the end. And most importantly, the gap between the manufactured device, and I think, Chris, that's what Gerät in German or
Yeah.
something like, right? Um, and the manufactured device and the human body, a body ill-fitted to the body, and you give the German here the Leib, the body of the machine. Now, the reason, because I wanted to bring this up, is that speaking of, you're seeing Anders really struggle with trying to find adequate categories here. The body is central really to the book, right? And I think, is in many ways still a kind of understudied theorist of the body. There's obviously much work in contemporary philosophy that's also moved into other fields about the importance of the body. How do we think about embodiment? And Anders had several years before this text. I think our audience, I hope, finds this helpful. He had authored a critique of Heidegger that was called On the Pseudo Concreteness of Heidegger's Philosophy, looking at the early Heidegger. So the Heidegger of being in time and kind of works adjacent to being in time around that same time period, that where often Heidegger was taken to be someone who had really made a breakthrough in terms of concrete philosophy, attention to questions of concrete human existence. And Anders says, no, in fact, no. There's a pseudo concreteness there. And one of the things he says a lot about in that essay is the body. In fact, that he wants to speak about, Anders wants to address the body in terms of hunger, in terms of sexuality and love. And he thinks obviously a great deal about emotions. He will talk about the need for a history of the emotions or history of the feelings. Writes a book on love that doesn't come out until 30 years after the obsolescence of the human, but a book called Leben gestern, or Love Yesterday. Anyway, the reason I bring this up, Chris, I think you're right about how Anders is what he's trying to do with the notion of soul. And yet, I think in the way we often think about these things, body and soul, in a very conventional, popular language, he kind of confounds us then by then saying that perhaps the most important gap that technology has created is between the device or the machine or a machine-driven process and the human body, and the inability of the body to match the rhythm of the machine, the structure of the machine, this this real like a kind of disequilibrium that he's looking at here. He'll have some really vivid things to say about Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times. He'll say Chaplin comes up in this book. He'll come up later for Anders, but for people who know that movie where Chaplin's on an assembly line, he's doing the same motion on the assembly line, like time and time again, to such a point that when he goes home after work, he's still doing the same gestures. He can't stop. And it's interesting that for Anders, this is really central, and I think a great insight of his is the impact on the body that these technologies have, especially if you have a more expansive notion of the body. And he'll have these really stunning examples about how the machine is so far ahead of what the human being can physically do and cognitively do as well. So anyway, it's just an interesting kind of point. Chris, not asking you, I don't think anybody who's
Oh,
working on him can reconcile this, but it's an interesting thing to know.
I think it really comes back to something I remembered as you were speaking. When you in that passage you were reading out, that leads to the question, so how are you going to talk about, you know, these people who are struggling to be in sync with machines? And he briefly talks about the subtitle of the book, right? And he gives us a more precise version, as he calls it, a longer version, where he says the precise version of the subtitle is On the Metamorphosis of the Soul in the Second Industrial Revolution, right? So actually, what he's pointing out there, yes, on one level, we are radically out of touch with what machines do. But the book is also, on a very real level, a mapping of all sorts of new emotional states that are only inducible by technology. And that's, I mean, the the world as Phantom and Matrix, the chapter on TV is really a mapping of the absorption in television, right? That's a new state of the soul. Being able to be gripped by a car race that is happening on TV between mini cars, but we know it's happening somewhere in the other end of the country. And then we are witnessing a fatal accident, and somehow we can't register it, but at the same time, we can, in a sense, almost enjoy this spectacle. Um, for him, that's one example, I think, of a new state of the soul, right? That's what this is how it feels to be in the second industrial revolution. And what are we to make of these feelings? Who do these feelings benefit? Where do they come from? How do these feelings connect us to other people, to politics, and just kind of mapping out how the emotions and states of the soul that dominate our interaction with technology seem to have very little in common with the world of emotion we know from, I don't know, great literature, the pre-industrial age, right? These kind of more kind of essentializing notions of human empathy, love, and feeling. He's kind of drawing these into question. He's saying, well, when millions of people have a parasocial relationship to a fictitious character, what is this emotional state? Can we really speak about love for fellow humans, or is this something else, right? And I think that makes the book quite exciting because on some level, I think what it could be read as is also a discussion of the user experience, right? How the body feels as we are absorbed by technological processes. And in that sense, I think it's quite a pioneering work. And sometimes the reason why it speaks so powerfully to us, I think, is that it captures a fundamental aspect of interacting with devices that are really captivating and fun to use and pleasurable. And, they allow us to have this conversation right here. Um, and that's magical, but at the same time, it points to something that is happening radically beyond our comprehension. So there's those kind of factors that I think play in, and you're really, really right to foreground the centrality of emotion and the centrality of the body. In many ways, I think you could, or I guess I would argue that it's as much a book about emotion as it is a book about technology.
I think that's a terrific point, Chris. I on this issue, I think we definitely agree, and there is something about the book that really does touch on an experience. You use the phrase experience, an experience of absorption or even subsumption by devices. People, I think in more kind of popular language, would talk about addiction.
Yeah.
Addicted to their phone or addicted to their laptop or whatever it might be. I mean, that there's a sense of being just pulled into this world and often to the point of even kind of losing your bearings, quite literally people losing their bearings and who can't drive even without looking at a smartphone or walk across the street without looking at a smartphone. So Anders is obviously not at this is decades before the kind of screen to screen existence so many of us have. Of course, like, I went to fill up my car this morning, and when I'm pumping gas, I have a screen that comes on, and there's an ad running, while I'm there, right? And so if I go onto YouTube, you watch anything, and there's 14 ads, that come in now, or if you're on your phone, um, you're just moving around. If you have a TV on, you're just moving seemingly from, screen to screen. So there is this sense about a kind of subsumption that has happened, that's gone even far beyond what Anders had lived to see. He died in 1992, but anticipates, in some ways. And I think, yes, it is a book, in many ways about these metamorphoses of the soul and or body. I just want to say and or body just to make sure people who think of body and soul as like distinct or maybe even opposed to one another, that um it's a much more intertwined, I think, Chris, we could probably agree, right, perspective that Anders offers us here about body and emotions and the cognitive issues about responsibility, a sense of responsibility, the critical faculty of reason. These things all seem to have um, they're linked very much for him in terms of capacities and how those capacities have been transformed by technology. So that takes us, you've already noted, Chris, a few of these um, concepts in the piece on radio and television. And I know you had wanted to make sure we spent some time with this idea of a kind of post-literary, this term that comes up in Anders' work, these ideas about the world phantom and the
Mm.
mass hermit, right? These are really such striking. I mean, when you hear them, they're very striking. Chris, so what do you think we should be aware of when we first run into these categories?
So I guess the post-literary is a very interesting term that Anders actually uses right at the beginning of the book in the introduction, very briefly. He gives this anecdote of how he's giving a paper at a conference about the rise of television and images. And he says, "Oh, I told them how it is, how television is transforming us into post-literary illiterates." And it's such a kind of a evocative phrase. Um, and so the book quite literally starts with this contrast by dramatizing words and text. The old technology of text is being subsumed by broadcast technologies, radio and television. And so when Christian Dries and I were like talking about possible framing in the postscript, how are we going to frame this text? We decided to start on a text from 1930 that is called Haunting and Radio by Anders. This is a very short text. And I might just quickly bring up the slide again because I have a really kind of significant image here. I think, well, just quickly go here. So the radio technology we're talking about at this age is this early German kind of scene here where we see everyone is chained quite literally to the device by headphones. So up until 1930, there's radio only with headphones, and we can see these people are really immersed in this crackling device. And Anders' very first engagement with technology I'm aware of is a text about the moment when when the loudspeaker is introduced. He's walking through the city and he hears the same song playing from various places, right? And he's kind of describing this as a technological haunting. The presence of like this ghostly voice of the singer is now haunting the streets. And I think it signifies that the world of imagination has become realized. Text has become stories, has we no longer read about them, we're no longer animating them ourselves as we read. We can actually experience the voice of someone else um, together in a distributed sense, both geographically and temporally. And he tries to capture this new reality. What is this entity that I'm interacting with when I'm listening to the radio, right? Or what is this entity that, if you're watching this YouTube video, who are Jason and I, right? Are we representations? Are we kind of performing on this video and in that sense, an artificial version of ourselves, or are we really ourselves, right? And he decides this question can't be answered, that we are, in a sense, phantoms, at once real and artificial at the same time, and that we really can't distinguish anymore between this old, like the old distinction of being and semblance is antiquated, right? It's obsolete. It no longer helps us understand this new world. And I think this is what makes the book so radical, right? It's not trying to say that somehow the broadcast world is fake or artificial or less real. He's saying, no, this is now our reality. We now inhabit this world. And if I just bring up the slide again, um, there's like instances in which the radio, for instance, as a political reality is really, really central to Anders's work. So the idea that you had to tune into the voice of Hitler or Goebbels um, is really central in the book, right? And he's basically saying, I mean, this is a very evocative propaganda poster of the People's Receiver, the radio device that the Nazi Party mass-produced and almost gave away as the People's Radio to everyone, so everyone could listen to this message. Anders presents it as an invasion, as a real invasion, right? The Nazis are really in your living room. They're not kind of metaphorically in there. You really are in that space and being dominated. And another really significant thing he dramatizes is President Harry S. Truman's radio broadcast on the day of Hiroshima, right? Where he's kind of pronouncing to the world this ultimatum: we've just dropped this bomb. If Japan doesn't surrender, more attacks will come. And this description of the unleashing of a power central, from which the sun derives its power. I think that's the quote that Harry Truman makes. And Anders kind of says, well, we're listening to this. We're experiencing and living this moment, whilst at the same time being radically unable to comprehend what this does to us, right? The kind of, what does it mean to be in the grip of this capacity of others to really intrude my life and to shape my world in a way that I can't really resist. And I think that haunting capacity and this attempt to kind of say, well, the world of human thought as it is recorded by people who knew text or only text is somehow no longer quite able to capture these realities of a technological world. And I think that's where the quest for a language comes from to a certain extent, is like, as someone who's highly well read, highly literary, highly in love with books. And we get a lot of scenes in which the book itself dramatizes Anders's loves for books. Jason, I think we were talking about this scene where he narrates being stopped by a highway cop outside of LA because he hasn't got a car, and they have this interaction, and the highway cop is asking him, why don't you have a car? Why are you a vagrant walking down the highway? And Anders kind of says, well, I prefer to spend my money on books, things I need more. And there's this very funny kind of scene, right? So that draws us in. So it's constantly dramatizing for us, I think, this sense that the thing you can see on our both of our screens, this massive bookshelf behind us, is somehow no longer able to capture or content or even counteract words that reach us through the medium of television and radio, right? Those words are backed up by Harry Truman has a very different power at his command as a poet, right? The poet might be able to send you some nice words, but Truman can unleash, a nuclear force. So I think, sorry, that's a bit of a rambling overview, but that's why I think the post-literary is really kind of one of those words that opens a certain perspective on the text. It's not there's so many entry points, but I think that's a really evocative one.
Yes, because he has these passages in there, which you've already kind of anticipated what I'm going to say here. These points about there being like a flood of images, a kind of world flood, like a saturation that people now experience in their daily lives with the spread of television. You reminded us about most television is still live television when the book appears. I think about, for an American audience, like a figure like Milton Berle, who was a big figure like in early television, a lot of the comedy that he did. But he also alludes to um, and this reconnects back to the point about this being an American text. He'll mention Orson Welles in War of the Worlds in 1938, and people began thinking that this is real, there is some kind of extraterrestrial invasion that's taking place. And he talks about soap operas in this a bit too. So there is the text itself is quite rich. I think someone who's looking for a lot of content analysis of television. He's more interested in the kind of the way these images being kind of pumped into our homes. To come back to the phrase about metamorphoses, we're transformed, kind of conditioned by these passivity. We kind of absorb, we become a kind of vessel for um, what mass media send to us. And he sees this as quite destructive, in terms of people, their own kind of position vis-a-vis, if you will, capital and the state, industry, that it can make them really, yes, really passive. They they begin to kind of lose the ability to discern what's real and not real because they're immersed in this world of phantoms, all the time. And this doesn't really do justice to it. It's a very complicated argument, and it's difficult to just summarize without just going point by point in the text. But I think both of us, Chris, are kind of getting at the central aspects, of this argument that for Anders, television was a momentous technological revolution. And yes, it does bear being put in the same book with the atom bomb and or hydrogen bomb. Now, it obviously doesn't physically destroy. It doesn't have that capacity, but I think he sees that, yes, it has far-ranging destructive effects on subjectivity, on people being subjects, right? In the sense that it does really impinge on ideas about subjectivity when it's often taken to just be entertainment. Um, it's there's a kind of normalization of television. People, after a while people are able to afford buying TV sets, and the TV sets themselves evolve from black and white to color. I'm old enough, Chris, to still remember the days of the antenna and the very snowy reception you would get on your TV screen. Um, and it's funny, many of us, I think of myself at times, just inadvertently, you end up having a kind of nostalgia about those things, and like if you go to a museum, say the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, right outside Detroit. I live in Michigan, and they'll show you a lot of these devices, gadgets from earlier earlier periods. And having been there a number of times and been there with large crowds, you can see it from other people, often this kind of nostalgia. They don't want to go back, replace their 55-inch color TV, high def, whatever, with one of these sets. But it's really an unusual kind of phenomenon when you see how people react when they see this old stove or an old microwave or an old television set. And Anders does get a bit about these connections people develop with certain kinds of devices, right?
Yeah.
A kind of attachment, and they get caught up in a way with their memories of childhood, etc. So no way we can do justice to all of this, Chris, but your
And I
comments
think,
made me
but
think about that.
no, but I think it's a beautiful example because it really does show how Anders, I think it really captures how Anders thinks about technology, precisely not as a set of things, but really as a deeply personal way of being in the world, a set of feelings that are part of yourself, even though they are the product of an interaction with a technology, right? So the thing you feel so meaningfully while watching TV is your soul, right? And just because it's created by TV doesn't make it in somehow any less significant to us. But the reality it connects to is a very different kind of reality to, the swooning poet in the park or expressing their inner life. And I think it really comes back to what we were talking about Marx, because the way he introduces this whole world of television is actually through by narrating it as a revolution in labor, right? That for TV to become a force in society, everyone will have to do this new form of unemployed work, he calls it, right? You will all have, everyone has to adjust their living rooms, right? You'll have to buy a TV set, you'll have to rearrange your house, you'll have to completely change your habit, you'll have to like stop going out with friends so you're home at the right time for your favorite program. And all this investment of energy ultimately benefits advertisers, politicians, the TV companies who have this new audience on tap, right, that they can sell. So Anders presents this as a new form of work that we've all been, in a sense, condemned to. And when I was like, first came across this, I couldn't help but think, of course, the closest approximation we have to that today is like the generation of data we all do constantly, that is the source of wealth in a lot of for big tech today. This is a tremendous investment of effort, but it's just not registered as such, right? So I think one of the strange things at the time, or one of the barriers to Anders really becoming the household academic name at the time, is that some of these images were perhaps a bit too strange, or too kind of exaggerated might be the word at the time, to be taken seriously. So when Anders said, like, when watching TV, you're really working for the TV company, that was a bit of a kind of analogy, a step too far, I think, at the time. But with a lot of much more recent media theory would basically say that's the basic condition of using media. Um, so I do think your example captures a lot, right? The kind of attachment to old technology is also alerting us to the momentous role technology plays in our lives.
Yeah, it gets into this, coming back to this issue about Anders and Marxism is such a complicated, um, it, in some ways, like he's expanding upon, at the same time radically challenging aspects of Marxism. But certainly in that text, Chris, as you point out in your kind of afterword to the book, you get these comments about alienation. There are even some places here and there where he's clearly riffing off Marxist ideas about alienation. And I think one of the things that's it's very provocative about the book is that there's something about a totality that emerges from this, even though you're getting fragmentary treatments of it, an essay, and it's not even the entire essay, but there'll be something, for example, like in the Promethean Shame essay about assembly line work. And then in the piece on radio and television, you get this sense about what happens to someone after they have left work and come home. And there's a kind of new form of subjection that people endure there, a kind of new area where they're losing control over their lives. This is how I read him. Like that's already happened at the workplace. Um, and it's now happening increasingly at home and at just deep levels of experience of just being human. Like this is sort of transforming us as 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 we take these things in is his argument. So you can see there's a kind of running engagement with people like Georg Lukács, the great Marxist theorist who wrote History and Class Consciousness, the theorist of reification, the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. There is, you can see, even when he's not necessarily um, mentioning them by name, you can tell that there's an engagement there. He does directly refer to Walter Benjamin, his work on um, technological reproducibility. So it is interesting. but yet at the same time, Chris, we get him saying like he clearly feels that a kind of Marxist class analysis is now not able to um, comprehend a lot of these developments. So he'll say maybe a class analysis works for television, a bourgeois TV problem versus a proletarian one. It absolutely does not work for the atom bomb. He'll say that, right? And he'll say things like, the kind of mass hermit phenomenon is becoming socially general. You're seeing it like across society. It's spreading, in fact, beyond North America and Western Europe. He was right. It was spreading. It would some places faster than others. Something like apocalypse blindness we haven't gotten to yet, but we'll get to shortly. He thinks it's something um, universal, and he challenges very directly the Marxist focus on the industrial working class, on the proletariat. The kind of classical proletarian internationalist socialism, and he'll say that the factory is not like a kind of education, a school for workers and militancy and solidarity and kind of coming together and responding to the dominance of the ruling class, the capitalist class, the experience of solidarity, of fighting for better conditions, better wages, unionization, strikes, collective bargaining, or even much more radical measures. He'll say, Chris, as you translate so bluntly, and it's just the way I think it should be rendered, it's very blunt. What he says is essentially the plant or the factory is the birthplace of the conformist. That's what he says. So it's such a rejoinder to at least certain Marxists that no, in fact, what the factory is doing is that it is part of this larger system of domination. And we'll see Anders, he's not so much, I think, in this text, but soon thereafter, he'll use this phrase from John Kenneth Galbraith, the affluent society, referring to this boom period in the capitalist world, the golden age of the kind of 3 decades after World War II. And he will largely align with other leftists who see the proletariat as more and more integrated into society. It's less and less the locus of radical opposition to capital. And in fact, I think what's quite telling, Chris, even we get it with the comment about Marx and economy is our fate, that capitalism becomes itself less and less important to him, never discarded, but he comes to see that its technology is the thing, if you will. Machines, this is really the thing. There's a kind of mechanization here that as a form of unfreedom that is our greatest menace right now that we have to confront. And that in itself, obviously, for Marxists will be, to put it mildly, controversial and questionable, arguable. But I think that's where this critique really does, it's it at its most radical. As you can probably tell, Chris, I have real disagreements with Anders on many of these things, but nonetheless, I find him to be as someone who is a Marxist and very interested in the history of Marxist socialism, but nonetheless, I take him seriously because he did offer a challenge. It's a very thought-provoking challenge, and at the same time, I don't at all want to dismiss him. I want to try to understand from him why does he make these particular moves, and he's not alone. I think there are many people who, like him, thought that the kind of, if you think about capitalism, for many people coming out of the 30s and 40s, the issue, well, there would be many issues you might have with capitalism, but not least was its crisis-prone character, right? The feeling that it was going over the cliff circa 1930. and for many years thereafter. And it's not until World War II that so many of these countries, including the United States under Franklin Roosevelt, comes out of it with a New Deal, all this state intervention. But it's then there's a period right after World War II where there's a lot of turmoil, a lot of labor unrest, and then circa 1950, there's this new prosperity that really does sit in, and it seems quite stable. There are recessions, but still, it seems like a quite stable configuration of capitalism. So I think one could see someone like Anders, or even someone like his friend Marcuse, struggling with the fact that capitalism seems to have moved beyond this crisis prone side of it. There's a lot less economic inequality. There's still class, but there's a lot less economic inequality. Workers have television sets, they have refrigerators, they can buy cars, they can take longer vacations. Many of them are unionized and have things like collective bargaining. Um, it's a period when many workers move into middle class, at least lifestyle. So this is a very long way of saying this
Mm.
is, I think it's a complicated thing um, to deal with, and we can't do justice to it fully here. But I think for our audience, just to flag for them that this is something that you're going to see in the book, and if you read beyond this book and Anders' later writings, you're going to see this come up again. So I appreciate
I,
your patience
if
with
we,
that, Chris.
no, no. What I think you raised such an important point, and it's one that I'm repeatedly coming across, and this question of capitalism, the politics of the text, and I think the two aren't mutually uh, exclusive to quite the extent that is sometimes portrayed. I think Anders is really trying to capture the rise of this new domain of power, where the intermediary, the device, the technology itself, has become to take on a dynamic that exceeds the classic Marxist framing of the class struggle and the classic, therefore also the question of what political action might consist of or what it comprises of. So I might just make two quick points that I think are quite important. When Anders first introduces the notion of the Industrial Revolution and this kind of idea, what are we, of a new Luddism? What should we be struggling against? He actually very explicitly says, well, today we can't be, the issue is much less the working conditions, the rights of workers, but the question should be what technologies are actually even produced in the first place, right? And he is talking here very specifically about the bomb, where he's saying it doesn't matter, like becoming conscious to the power of the bomb doesn't matter because the problem is that it can destroy the world, regardless of whether you want it or not. And so it's the existence of the very device itself and the inbuilt tendencies of the device that require a new type of reckoning with power. What is this new power? And who are these men who wield this power? And how can they be held to account and made to comprehend what they're wielding? So that's one point, right? And I think the other point, it's maybe a passage I over rely on in my reading and framing of Anders, but I just personally really like it in the introduction to a collection called Mensch ohne Welt, the human without world, or the human or humans without world. It's a collection on literature. He evokes the image of a builder building a house for someone else, right? And he's basically saying, oh, with Marx, we can say like, the builder never owned the house they helped build for someone else who had the means to live in it. But he's then talking about the world of technology in these terms. He's kind of saying, we're being excluded from the world we are building for others in this kind of way. But he is using a word, ausgeschlossen, that is much more like a language you might use if you're being excluded from a social circle. you're being made to be this onlooker onto this prosperity of others, and you haven't been permitted into this world. And zugelassen, the word he then uses, you haven't been granted access, um, can be used to talk about technological objects. So if a car isn't road legal, it's not zugelassen. So it's kind of saying we're witnessing the rise of a world in which we are, by mere fact of being human or by mere fact of being mere users of technology rather than owners of the infrastructures that run our lives, we're declared as no longer needed, illegal, like non-road legal, right? So I think what he's actually capturing is more the evolution of capitalism as it becomes highly, highly dominated by these powerful technologies that connect us. So, yes, it is often framed as Marx's ideas are no longer relevant, but I think it's also, I personally give Anders the benefit of the doubt that he's trying to capture this new, what is this new aspect, the technological one. And I think the work on nuclear weapons really, really helps put that into perspective. So maybe, maybe if we go to our long overdue final, final little kind of waypoint and look at that,
Yes.
I think there's a really, really kind of difficult transition in the text where suddenly we arrive at nuclear weapons that are described as this completely unique new form of power, new technology that is unlike anything else, that is precisely a kind of the question of a proletariat becomes meaningless because the whole of humanity is now facing this power. Even the people wielding it are subject to it. But at the same time, this unique device is continuously described as if it was somehow exemplary for a new world order. So there's a real tension in the text itself that is quite hard to get to grips with.
Yes. Yes, and I think one of the things that if for people who have come across Anders and maybe have even that maybe they've read some of the work in German or even some of the that you just know here, forgive the shameless self-promotion, but I did this volume on Anders in 2015. Thanks, Chris, with Günther Bischoff and Bernhard Fetz, and we actually republished a translation of a piece Anders did circa 1960 called Theses for the Atomic Age. And there's this argument in there, right, about Hiroshima as a kind of world condition that's there. And later he'll republish some of his writings on the bomb in a piece called Hiroshima ist überall. Hiroshima is everywhere. But what's striking, Chris, is that Hiroshima and Nagasaki are mentioned in this essay, but they don't play the role that they will play later when there's, I think, a more developed historical treatment of these things. There's a lot of attention to nuclear testing. That's a very big part of it. And as you rightly pointed to very early in our discussion, that the hydrogen bomb is as much, if not more, of a centerpiece of this the as Little Boy and Fat Man, the two atom bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, as those weapons, even though Anders understandably resist the term weapon for these because of their just overwhelming power. But this is a text that's really anchored in the mid 50s. Now the Soviets have the atom bomb. The US and the Soviets have the hydrogen bomb. Britain has joined the nuclear club in 1952. France is only a few years away, and then China a few years after that. And of course, one of the things I think is really striking, and we have a reference in here to pilots in this particular book. And then in 1959, Anders starts up a correspondence with a member of the 509th Composite Group, the American Airmen based on Tinian Island in the Marianas that were involved in the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Colonel Paul Tibbets and the Enola Gay, that's the aircraft that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Of course, where you're at in Australia, it's August 6th. So we're right there. It's a
True.
matter of just a few hours away for me. So it's good of us to remember that, especially with Anders, this became a central kind of moment in his intellectual biography. He will talk about when he first heard the news about the dropping of the bomb. Right. So there's all of this that has to be taken into account when one thinks um, about Anders and the atomic age, Anders and history after Hiroshima, if you will. Um, that he's dealing with. He's right here on the cusp of major developments. The first intercontinental ballistic missiles, right, coming online in the mid 1950s, and Anders' interest and concern with pilots. Francis Gary Powers later, the U-2 pilot, spy plane pilot, and yet the air thermo or nuclear or thermonuclear weapons delivered by aircraft is becoming increasingly secondary by this point as rocket technology, much of it pioneered by Nazi Germany, and scientists who then are brought into the United States or Britain, um, and these rockets then being modified and developed where they can carry these bombs. They're nuclear missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles. That Anders is right here. And speaking of a terrifying situation, his book sits right in the middle of this. Chris, I think it's always kind of good for us to remember that he's trying to keep pace with such a cataclysmic reality that's unfolding. And within a few years, people will start referring to mutually assured destruction.
Mhm.
Right. So I'm
No,
glad you kind of said, yes, we need to talk about this because it's such a central part of the book.
and I think it's really interesting how Anders became, or is in many circles known as a writer of an anti-nuclear activist, anti-nuclear philosopher, writer. Um, and there's a certain um, kind of paradox that, to my knowledge at least, the Antiquiertheit, the Obsolescence is the first actual engagement with nuclear weapons. So it took him a good 10 years. I know, Jason, you actually pointed out there's a very short one-line mention in a reflection on what it means to write poetry from the late 1940s, where we have this one little line about, poetry should be trying to approximate the scale of this destruction and horror. That's what it should be. It should kind of commemorate that this happened and should make sure we don't ignore it because it is so easy to ignore given to the scale, given its overwhelming kind of reality. But apart from that, there's no real mention. It doesn't really appear in writing at all. And then we get what is pretty much the longest text in the book dedicated to apocalypse blindness, which is really a dramatization of an inability to process or comprehend this this new world situation, this new kind of Schicksal, this new fate of living in the shadow of the bomb, and of trying to, in a very explicit sense, find the language to talk about it. Because I mean, the chapter opens literally by saying, you know, it's absurd to write philosophy about nuclear weapons, uh, weapons that can affect anyone in a language that only a few philosophers can understand. So it's literally kind of saying, in this new global context, there's a new need for a new kind of global appreciation of or a global framework through which this could be comprehended. And I think in many ways, Anders is very strongly responding to the media coverage of the time. Um, so when I was doing the translation and in the run up to it, I actually did did a bit of like kind of research and trying to figure out how is this reported? How is this and it's an absolute media spectacle, right? The way that I guess we're getting coverage about AI today is very kind of similar to the kind of coverage that was extended to nuclear technology, atomic tests, and a really significant milestone and one that Anders is essay, I think, to an extent, responds to is the ABLE test. The test of the first test of nuclear weapons to occur. And this in itself is, I think, a highly significant circumstance. So I'll just bring up this kind of little little point. So these are the tests that happened on Bikini Atoll, the very famous first series of tests. This is from the official pictorial record produced by the Joint Task Force One, which is the actual task force undertaking this test. Um, this this whole event was accompanied by a large Hollywood crew. It was aired in cinemas across the US. This was mass publication. And I think the way the bomb is framed is this immense power that that is blinding to the eye. They literally say use these terms that no one can see, no one can comprehend, yet it has this kind of documentation. It's something that Anders is responding to very strongly. And I did some work on that as well. Um, and one of the central points that Anders is saying is like in this framing, you know, if we look at what this official record is saying, it's talking about the Bikini Atoll of one of even in the modern age of flight, it may accurately be described as one of the remote places of the Earth, right? And it's kind of so this pictorial record is kind of almost presenting the places at which the tests are happening as not even really on the planet in that kind of sense. And Anders is saying, well, this is completely untrue, right? That the nuclear fallout was measured all across the globe. This event is actually a global event. It can't even be called as a test. It is an actual use of nuclear weapons. This distinction between trialing a technology and its impacts on the world no longer made sense. All these old categories that are being used to talk about the technology have become antiquated. And I think that chapter in particular is gradually working through established ways of thinking about weapons, technology, morality, and just kind of trying to show up the complete kind of failure of those frameworks to capture a technology as complex and powerful as nuclear weapons and as socially complex, right? One of the points he will make, and I think he's echoing Truman's speech, the radio broadcast, where Truman says something like hundreds of thousands of people were involved in the production of the bomb, but no one really knew what they were doing, right? Because and he's celebrating the secrecy and the smoothness of the organization to create this weapon. And Anders is kind of latching onto this and saying, what is this new form of action in which we're contributing to these destructive forces without realizing it, without ever becoming aware that we're, in a sense, complicit. Um, so I think these are some of the kind of touchstones that this essay is starting to quite literally map out. It presents itself as a mapping of the nuclear situation.
Yes. Yeah, the point about the kind of like the cartographic um sort of analogy that he makes. Yeah, this is terra incognita. Um, he even has a kind of, I think, a sort of reference. We're coming back to Marx again, but no royal roads, here in this terrain, like Marx had said in Capital Volume One. Something I think like that here, that we're really here in this new terrain. He'll mention a figure like Albert Einstein, who had died just the previous year before the book appeared, as one of the few people Anders thought really did was really able to discern how terrifying this new reality was. There some references in there to Oppenheimer for those interested in the film from a few years ago, the Christopher Nolan um, film as well. So it is an extraordinary essay, Chris. And I will just say, for what it's worth, that whatever my disagreements may be with Anders on like thinking about the analytical power, um, the the continued importance of Marxism or not, this text and then those that follow it. And I think it's important for us to mention, Chris, that you, along with Manuela Kulka, translated this really amazing text Anders did a few years later, where he recast the story of Noah and the ark. And thanks to the translation the two of you did, that is out in the world now. There will be many essays that follow. This thesis for the atomic age is in the volume that we did. And there are several others. A piece on responsibility today that's really an astonishing work, where he begins to just work out from the insights laid out in this text and develop them. So it's the touchstone, and yet he really will carry this forward and do some work. I think it's probably some of the most important work ever done. I don't have any problem describing Anders as the most significant theorist of omnicide we still have. He would use the term in 1980, globocide. Omnicide is a different thinker, but it's um, a little more common, a little more familiar, to people. But yes, he does, like the complete like annihilation of human life, of all life altogether, and he doesn't hold back. Because what's remarkable is that once you get into the collection of essays that appear, they appear under a couple of different titles, but finally under the Atomare Drohung, the atomic threat, um, you get like some depictions of what a nuclear confrontation might look like. And with Anders, he doesn't um, concern himself with some kind of limited nuclear conflict where states may launch one or a few of these weapons, and then they step back from the cliff. He wants to imagine a full-blown nuclear catastrophe, and I think that's what's significant about him, really vital about him, is the radicalism of it. He feels like it's irresponsible to not take thought to that limit, because that we don't know if this ever occurred, how far it might go before it's halted. We need to presume the worst. And we haven't talked about it yet, Chris, but obviously he has this methodology, if you will, organized around the notion of Übertreibung, exaggeration, where you exaggerate the impact of technologies. And I think you do see it there in its most frightening form, where he just takes you right to right kind of over the cliff, the proverbial cliff, and just tries to show you that this is a logic of total annihilation that's there. All, as he puts it, humanity as a whole is killable now. We've reached
Mm.
that threshold. And coming back to an area where, I mean, some of our earlier discussions, where he will say that what should be at the forefront of philosophical thought and political praxis is the question of the transformation or liquidation of the human by its own products, right? And so the final essay, you get this just there's no, it's unrelenting, really, that text, and just forces people to not evade it, not minimize it. Um, that you have to kind of go through it. You have to think this through to the dregs. Really, you have to really think it through. That this is the dilemma that haunts us all now, which is the prospect of human extinction.
And I think that's a really, really important point that also connects to some of the earlier questions we made about politics. So I might just hold up your volume quickly. As you've read some nice passages, I thought I'd highlight the third thesis from the thesis for the atomic age, where I think he's really condensing some of the logics, where he's saying not atomic weapons in the political situation, but political action in the atomic situation. So he goes about describing how political actions and developments are taking place within the nuclear situation, within this situation, within this world condition. And I think this is a really, really important point uh, to think through, because not only is he saying that, nuclear weapons, although they're always used as political instruments, as we're witnessing in the present on several different levels, um, this is this is the danger, right? That they are being misapprehended as if they were some sort of tool, but the tool itself has created a new reality in which these kind of threats are always ultimate threats. They always bring within themselves the possibility of this kind of destruction. Um, but I think there are also a statement on technology itself, right? We live in a political situation in which these technologies can simply be developed and created, right? So there needs to be some sort of social transformation happening, or some sort of social structure in place for this technology to emerge. And a lot of what Anders is documenting throughout this book is precisely, going back to that statement of like the factory worker is the extreme conformist. I think that relates back to this statement of Truman, right? If you're working in a factory and you don't really know what you're producing or what that might be useful for, or if you're a scientist and you're helping to create new knowledge, or if we today are users of technology and create data, and this data will go on to automate something that might be highly destructive, we are actively contributing to the rise of this world condition, this conditional threat, my way or no way kind of thing that is being actualized for Anders in a very literal way. And he, is kind of turning, I think, to the most exaggerated technology, the most powerful device to reveal a kind of a more general and subtle tendency. And I think there is, a lot to be irritated about when reading Anders. And I think in many ways, I'm pretty certain that this is often by design, especially as you get to know rhetoric and style and how a person writes across a whole oeuvre of works. There are certainly framings that are meant to have a kind of a take the reader aback and make them kind of disagree with the text, precisely because, as you said so well, it is trying to make us work through something. So yeah, I hope, people will take a lot of agitation from this text in the best kind of way, and that it will remain to be a generative text. I think it's, it's a remarkable work that I think, Jason, you and I have been talking about for, many, many, many years. So yeah.
Yes, yes, we definitely have, and I think to echo what you said, Chris, that yes, there's a kind of shock effect of some of Anders' writings, like they jolt, they really they're jarring, in the way oftentimes when you see like a work of art or even listen to a piece of music that kind of shakes you, it has that level, I think, of impact, especially some of these particular texts. And I would just note, I know we're kind of getting here toward the end, and we're testing the patience of our viewers who even who can stop and start as they want. It's now been some 2 hours, but I thought I would just note here something from the last part of the essay on the bomb, um, which is getting to this issue kind of what is to be done against such a nightmarish um, threat, a nightmarish. I think the phrase now would be existential threat. This is something we is much more kind of the contemporary parlance. But and also where he's at in 1956, as opposed to where he's going to go within a decade on these issues about political practice. But he says here, and this is really the last several paragraphs of the essay, that unless single individuals were to begin, like conscientious objectors, to publicly attest under oath that they, in full knowledge of the possible dangers, will, and then he's about to list for us what they would do under oath, never participate in any form in anything that could have even the slightest, most indirect bearing on the production, testing, or use of that thing, the bomb, nuclear and thermonuclear weapons. No matter what public pressure or physical duress they are placed under. And he goes on, swear to speak of the thing as if it were a curse. So we now have some obligation that affects us at the level of everyday speech. Educate those who shruggingly reconcile themselves to its existence. This will be, Chris, I know you've talked about this elsewhere. This is a big issue for him, how people can kind of live with the bomb, or kind of have a kind of pseudo awareness of it. He's always looking at various forms of self-deception, and also in cases of just outright propaganda by nuclear states to minimize the threat posed by these weapons, but also other things that are more subtle, just everyday people, citizens who can tell themselves certain things so they don't have to do much about it. So he'll go on then to say demonstratively distance themselves from anyone who seeks to defend the thing. So there's a kind of refusal to keep company with someone who, in some form or fashion, advocates the production or the testing, the maintenance of these weapons. And then finally, unless such a start is made, and unless others follow their lead and others theirs, until those who refuse to take this oath become notorious. And here we go, Chris. I would pick up on this. We get a reference to the workers' movement, become notorious and known as scabs and strike breakers in humanity's fight for its continued existence. For the bomb has achieved one thing, it has turned the fight into one of all of humanity. So that's a really, there's so much one can say about that. I mean, just in those 3 or 4 paragraphs, there is an entire politics that's packed in there. Um, but obviously, obviously for you and me, but I think for people who are coming to Anders' work, it's good to know that he will become involved with mass anti-nuclear campaigns and organizations. He travels to Japan in 1958, visits Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He establishes long-lasting connections with people in ban the bomb politics. And speaking of this point about Marxism, he will eventually say that the old proletarian internationalism has to yield now. Workers of all lands unite. Marx and Engels, the Communist Manifesto, that has to yield to a politics based around survival, where human beings, as he puts it, imperiled of all lands, unite across national borders to abolish these weapons, to abolish all testing and design of these weapons. And there's a kind of total abolitionism that Anders will advocate after 1956. So he's not there yet, but you can see a lot of where he's going. Here, it's still kind of focused more at the level of individuals, this notion of conscientious objectors as being a kind of analogy. But it is also really fascinating to see what he's telling people to do. Like there's kind of concrete steps they can do in how they act, how they think, how they speak in relation to the presence of the bomb, and how it hangs over the lives of contemporaries to the point where he'll say that, yeah, that there's a kind of permanent aftermath to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? There's no escape from it. We'll never totally exit the atomic Zeitalter. The atomic age is in some ways inescapable, but we can we can radically minimize the threat that these weapons pose, but that'll be a collective effort, some protracted effort to do that. So, Chris, I've been talking a lot here in the last few minutes. Things you'd like to say by way of conclusion? We should probably wrap this up. I know we could keep talking for hours here, but maybe we should
No.
follow Anders' own example here about being cautious about what we say and how much more we say and the like. But so some final things, I guess, by way of conclusion.
No, just a big thank you and a wonderful page you've picked out in the sense that I think it really takes us back into this essay and into Anders's kind of voice and one of the striking aspects of the work of being kind of uncompromising in the way it maps out or makes us all confront the hypocrisies, conflicts, uh, decisions that are momentous but unnoticed that happen in the course of our interaction with technology and as we go through our lives. So I think it's a really nice place to end. And I'm glad we were able to have this conversation and kind of do this in a recorded setting for once, what we usually do, just between ourselves.
Agreed. Yes, thank you, Chris. So let me, yeah, by way of conclusion from my part, just thank you for all the work you've done on Anders, not only as a translator, but the remarkable pieces you've authored about him. I think they've really contributed to um, putting him, talking about this language of cartography, putting him on a map of contemporary thought in the Anglophone world. And so I hope people will pick up a copy of Günther Anders, The Obsolescence of the Human. And I'm glad you mentioned Christian Dries. Hope you will, especially if you know German, look up Christian's work. He's done an astonishing amount of work. Um, Books and articles on Anders, as well as editing, especially many early works of Anders that are out there. Should also note the back cover for people, a picture of Anders. In fact, when he was in the United States, here is as well, reinforcing this point about this being in many ways an American text, even if a long delayed entry into the American public sphere. So we hope that people find this useful and will go from there to read Anders and engage him and argue with him. Um, Chris, as we both know, there's a passage from 1982 from Anders from a text called Ketzerian Heresies, where he was very frustrated that his arguments hadn't at least deserved to be attacked. This was such a kind of typical understatement. So we're not encouraging people necessarily to attack the arguments, but to really engage with them, and that I think that you will find them endlessly interesting and startling and um, pushing you to think about not only adequate thought for an age so dominated by technology, but also an adequate politics and adequate praxis. So, with that, Chris, again, thanks very much for your participation in this. And, who knows? We may decide that down the road we'll want to revisit this and have another one of these conversations. But until then, I'd like to thank everyone who viewed this webinar and took the time to work through it. So thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
your
Thank you,
attention.
Jason. Thank you.
Yes, my
Thank you.
pleasure. Thank you all for your interest in this subject.